And this story, it starts in late April 2023 when some folks on Poplar Island out there in the Chesapeake Bay were walking through the marsh, and they flushed a female short-eared owl from the marsh. And they continued walking and they stumbled into a short-eared owl nest. And that nest had 4 chicks in it. And this nest was the first confirmed active short-eared owl nest in Maryland in decades. I mean, this was a big deal. Fortunately, just happened chance, there was one of our colleagues on the island named Melissa, and she had the right size band for these birds.
Welcome again to the Land and Wildlife Speaker Series. I'm Luke McCauley with University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Wildlife Management Specialist for the state of Maryland. Today, I'm really excited to have Andy Brown and Alex Pellegrini speaking. We'll be talking about one nest box at a time, bringing barn owls back to Maryland's working landscapes. Andy is the Farmland Raptor Program Manager for the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership. He leads this effort. He graduated from Frostburg State with a wildlife degree, worked for Calvert County Natural Resources for 34 years, and he retired in 2020. Calvert County is close to my heart. I live in Calvert County. It's a beautiful county. And after 34 years there, he departed and was getting busy and interacting a lot with the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership, where they began this Farmland Raptor program. So that's Andy. Alex is his program coordinator. He helps with all sorts of aspects of keeping that program running. He graduated from Towson with a biology and animal behavior degree, worked at Patuxent River Park for a few years, worked on ospreys and sorrel rails with Greg Kearns. And after working as an intern and a volunteer for a couple of years, he ended up getting on as a full-time position with this program. So welcome, Andy and Alex. Really looking forward to this talk. With that, I want to say thank you for joining.
Well, thank you all for attending today for this topic that is kind of near and dear to my heart. I've been working on this for quite a long time. And thank you, Luke, for your introduction. As mentioned, we are Andy Brown and Alex Pellegrini, manager and coordinator of the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership Farmland Raptor Program. So we're going to be presenting today on the topic, about bringing barn owls and kestrels back to the Maryland's working landscapes. And we'll get into some detail about the work that we've done and some of the requirements that these birds have to survive. I began working with barn owls in the Patuxent River Valley in the late 1980s, early 90s. Some of you may know Scott Smith, wildlife ecologist from Y Mills in Maryland DNR. He's a close friend of mine. And back in the late 1980s, when he first started with Maryland DNR, one of his first projects was barn owls in Dorchester County. And I had the pleasure to be able to assist him in some of the work that he had done there in Dorchester, and then thought to myself, well, let's start this over in Calvert. So I began a nest box project in the early 90s in Calvert County along the Patuxent River. At that time, barn owl was listed by Audubon on their blue list. And in the early 90s, Maryland Heritage, Wildlife and Heritage put barn owl on a watch list for the state. So we started putting nest boxes up along the Patuxent River and monitored those boxes for a number of years, for close to 30 years. Next. In 2000, the federal government issued a program, a grants program called the State and Tribal Lands Wildlife Grant that states could apply for a grant money, federal money, to assist with wildlife research projects. In 2005, Congress mandated that in order to apply for this grant, the states had to develop what is called a state wildlife action plan. This state wildlife action plan, among a lot of other requirements, illustrated those wildlife species from the state, anywhere from insects, mollusks, up through large mammals, that were species of greatest conservation need. So there's a long list for each category: birds and reptiles, amphibians, etc. That state wildlife action plan is required to be updated every 10 years. In 2015, it was updated, and as a result, shortly after, the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership was formed. Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership is a nonprofit organization that was designed to create partnerships between governmental and non-governmental agencies to further the conservation efforts of these bird species listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan. In 2019, I started, I collaborated with researchers along the Patuxent River Valley, Greg Kearns with Patuxent River Park and Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Patty Delgado with Jug Bay Wetlands Sanctuary to develop some research goals, conservation goals for barn owls along the Patuxent River. Attending that initial meeting was Chris Eberly, who was the executive director of the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership at the time, and asked if we could adopt these same goals, these same conservation goals on a statewide level. He then asked if we could work together at helping develop a Maryland Farmland Raptor Program. And so that began in 2019. The goals that we adopted at the onset of the program was to gain a better understanding of the ecology of farmland raptors in the state of Maryland. In order to do this, we needed to obtain a baseline for their abundance statewide, identify those habitats that were important or critical for their survival, ensure adequate and continuous monitoring of the population, broaden citizen participation, and be a principal gateway for all of the data on these raptor species that is collected throughout Maryland. We identified 4 raptors that were listed by the State Wildlife Action Plan: 2 owls and two hawks, the American barn owl, the short-eared owl, northern harrier, and American kestrel, to focus our work.
And this is where I come in. I know the title of this talk focuses on barn owls and kestrels, and we will get to them, but I want to start by working through all 4 of our focal farmland raptor species. And the reason that I want to do this is that they all respond to the same types of landscape decisions. So as we move through them, I want you to keep in mind how changes in vegetation and field structure and open space are affecting each one. And we'll start with this guy here, the northern harrier. And you probably recognize this bird. And if you know it, you might know it by a different name, maybe the marsh hawk or the hen harrier, or my personal favorite, what they call these guys right here, the adult males, they call them gray ghosts. And this is likely a species you're familiar with seeing, but in the winter, I would say. And I stress in the winter there because while northern harriers are considered an apparently secure non-breeder in Maryland, they're actually an imperiled breeding species in the state, which is what that S2B status right here is reflecting. Now, here's a very rare photo of a northern harrier in Maryland carrying nesting material. This is the only image I'm aware of this behavior in the state, and you could probably tell that it's the only one given the fact that I had to resort to using an image of this quality, which I'm allowed to joke about because I know the photographer very well. But stepping back into the bigger picture here, when you look at the surrounding states across the mid-Atlantic, you can see that harriers are ranking even more severely as S1 or critically imperiled breeders. And what we're seeing here isn't unique to Maryland, right? So across the region, northern harriers, they're tracking the availability of these large open grassland and wetland habitats, and they tend to decline when those habitats have been reduced or broken up, fragmented. So at Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership's Farmland Raptor Program's current capacity, our work with northern harriers is still very much in the development phase. We're continuing to refine our conservation goals for this species in Maryland, but we are opportunistically banding these birds through our field work with other farmland raptors. And my quick aside here, in case anybody here is unfamiliar with what bird banding is, the quick version is it involves placing a small aluminum alloy band on a bird's leg, like the one you could see pictured here. It's essentially weightless, and each band has a unique 9-digit number on it, which allows the individual bird to be identified. It's kind of like a social security number. It can give you a point A when it was put on and a point B when it was encountered again in the future. So here's some pictures of us, in the banding efforts we've made. We're also collecting a basic suite of data, but we're not going to get too into the weeds here in the interest of time about what we are collecting on these birds. And these captures are occurring during our field work, which is focused on the next species we'll discuss, the short-eared owl. So this beautiful guy here is considered an S1 breeder in Maryland. So this breeding status is even more concerning than that of northern harriers in the state. And what this S1 status means is it means that they're a critically imperiled breeding species in Maryland. And, we'll zoom out again. We can look at the whole mid-Atlantic we can see that short-eared owls are quite imperiled overall. So, along with what I just showed you with northern harriers, if you have a mental image of that map, this is really underscoring that broader pattern that we're seeing across North America. So, grassland birds are the most rapidly declining group of birds. And the farmland raptors we're talking about, are no exception. And I'll take this opportunity for another quick aside. Something interesting about short-eared owls. Short-eared owls and northern harriers are two ground nesting farmland raptors. And we'll talk about the kind of nesters that our other two farmland raptors are later on. But short-eared owls and northern harriers are ground nesters. And this brings me to a bit of a story here. And this story, it starts in late April 2023 when some folks on Poplar Island out there in the Chesapeake Bay were walking through the marsh, doing whatever they were doing. I'm not exactly sure. And they flushed a female short-eared owl from the marsh. And they continued walking and they stumbled into a short-eared owl nest. And that nest had 4 chicks in it. And this nest was the first confirmed active short-eared owl nest in Maryland in decades. I mean, this was a big deal. Fortunately, just happened chance, there's one of our colleagues on the island named Melissa, and she had the right size band for these birds. And these birds represented the second, third, fourth, and fifth short-eared owls ever banded in Maryland. One of those birds was later recovered January 2025, so a year and a half later. And it was actually lethally removed, so shot as a flight safety risk at Reagan National Airport over here at this pin. And you can see this is only about 35 miles west from where it was originally banded on Poplar Island, it's pretty surprising for a species we generally think of as highly nomadic. And I want you to keep this in mind in a few slides when I talk about these big questions. The question here is, did this bird stay in the area, or did it migrate north and then south again and return to essentially the same area? It's astonishing, actually. But prior to Melissa banding these birds, there had actually only ever been one short-eared owl banded in Maryland, and that was a single adult, as you can see here, banded in Caroline County. So right there, owl, short-eared, 1975. And I only bring this up just to illustrate how little attention short-eared owls have received in Maryland for a very long time. And before Andy and I began the field work I'll talk about in a second here that we're currently doing, that one bird from 1975 was the only adult that was ever banded in the state. And then, half a century later, we've been able to band 8 more short-eared owls and do some in-hand work with them. And doing this in-hand work and getting to that point was certainly no easy task. And we very quickly realized this. We realized it was pretty new ground that we were working with, capturing these adult birds in the winter. I mean, these are a very difficult species to work with. For God's sake, the bird that was banded on Poplar and then shot at Reagan, I mean, that just really goes to show how difficult they are to capture. Because if USD APHIS at that airport was able to capture that bird, they certainly would have. But they had to resort to these lethal control measures. And, for that matter, they're extremely difficult to study for this reason, especially in these low density areas like Maryland. In Maryland, you'll often find them in just 1 or 2 birds at a site, rarely more than 3 or 4. And in those situations, they're very hard to catch, especially when they're in low density. And there's been very little work, surprisingly, to develop these capture techniques for these low density sites in the winter. In fact, one of the only published papers specifically on short-eared owl capture techniques details somebody hanging out the side of a helicopter with a rocket net. And that's, how they captured these. But we're not going to get any rocket nets or helicopters here at Farmland Raptor Program. So in order to study them, we had to develop these trapping techniques that you can see. And we really had to start from the bottom, develop these and talk to people and see if there was anything, because there wasn't many publications to refer to or anything like that. And I'll stay out of the weeds again with the trapping methods. I keep mentioning that, but if you want to get into the weeds with us, we are doing other talks for the International Owl Center in a few weeks here. You can find those online. But the point here is that in the case of the short-eared owl, having a bird in the hand is necessary to answer some of these conservation questions that we have. And we're collaborating with people from all over the world, just a few of whom are shown here, in order to answer these questions. And one of the biggest reasons that it's so important to have this wide spread collaboration is because short-eared owls are so nomadic. So they can move widely and unpredictably, and it makes them incredibly difficult to study and understand which habitats they rely on throughout their annual cycles, especially in the eastern United States. So you can see here, this is the only published telemetry study out of the U.S. with short-eared owls. And this is solely concentrating on the western United States. There has been some telemetry work done in New York, but that's still unpublished. Because they are so nomadic, more so than any of our other farmland raptors that I'm talking about today, that we're talking about, these conservation questions, they can't be solved at a single state level. And that's why these collaborations matter. That's why we're working to eventually bring this tracking work to the eastern United States so we can identify these critical habitats across their annual cycle. But anyway, given that this talk is titled Bringing Barn Owls and Kestrels Back to Maryland's Working Landscapes, that's probably enough about the non-barn owl and kestrels here. So let's move on and let's get to it and talk about the American kestrel, this small little charismatic raptor here. It's North America's smallest falcon and smallest bird of prey on the continent. It's roughly the size of a mourning dove. So you're probably familiar with mourning doves in your backyard, but you can see these two kestrels, one here on either side of this mourning dove pair in the middle there. And they're so small that they fit very comfortably in the palm of your hand. But bringing it back to these nature serve maps, okay? Especially compared to our last two farmland raptors, American kestrels actually appear fairly secure overall. In fact, here in Maryland, you can see that light blue there. They are listed as an apparently secure breeding species. So, you might reasonably ask, why would a species like this be one of our focal species? And to really illustrate this for you, I want to show you something pretty incredible that we have at our disposal at the Maryland Bird Conservation Partnership, and in Maryland in general, for that matter. And that is the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas, it's a citizen science effort to systematically document these breeding and breeding behaviors of birds across the state. So you can see the state is divided into grids of survey units, or blocks as they're called. And within each block, observers look for evidence of breeding. And then, when these data are compiled, they give us maps like this one right here. And you can see that in the green areas is where those kestrels are confirmed breeding. And this is representing VBA1. So that's the first statewide atlas that ran from 1983 to 1987. And then the second one was conducted from 2002 to 2006. So every 20 years, there's going to be a breeding bird atlas. And we can see, because of this, how breeding distributions change over time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to flip from 1 to 2 and just watch those green blocks disappear. So 1, 2, and then to 3. So you can see from the first breeding bird atlas through the third breeding bird atlas, which just wrapped up in 2024, you can see how much of that green is disappearing. Overall, from the first to the third breeding bird atlas, kestrels have declined in Maryland by 53%, breeding kestrels. This is absolutely alarming. And one of the most direct ways that we can help address that decline is by adding breeding sites back into already suitable habitat. So we can do this for American kestrels and barn owls, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But these two farmland raptors, I told you I'd tell you what type of nesters they are, and they're cavity nesting species. A quick important note here is that kestrels, they're not marsh associated like our harriers and our short-eared owls and our barn owls. Kestrels rely on these open landscapes like pastureland and hayfields and agricultural fields with edges, though, because agricultural fields where pesticides and rodenticides are used are not great. In fact, they're essentially a sterile environment. There's no food for them. And I'll keep bringing back this idea. And in these sites, with the pasturelands, the hayfields, etc., natural cavities are often limited. I'm sure you can imagine. So installing these nest boxes, it's replacing a missing breeding site, and it's allowing these kestrels and these barn owls to actually nest in this habitat that's suitable for them. And our current nest box work that we're doing is supported by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we're implementing that work in collaboration with Hawk Mountain to restore nesting opportunities for farmland raptors across the watershed. So just to take a look at some of that 2025 nest box occupancy data, and I'll note that this Kestrel box program is still relatively new, okay? But this is what we're working with so far. So looking at these boxes that we have up, so out of 64 total boxes, about 26% of those were occupied in 2025. And, about 3/4 were unoccupied. But out of those occupied boxes, roughly 65% were successful. And what this tells us is that when we place nest boxes in suitable habitat, kestrels are using them, right? So it's that idea of you build it and they will come. And they're successfully nesting too in these boxes. And at the vast majority of these locations, kestrels were actually not nesting on the property prior to box installation. There wasn't a natural cavity for them to nest in. And to collect this kind of occupancy data, we of course can't do it alone. Okay, 64 boxes, it might seem manageable, but when I tell you that we're banding the chicks and we have these other farmland raptors to deal with, Andy and I realistically cannot do this by ourselves. And that's why we have this incredible volunteer network, which is absolutely essential. We're incredibly grateful for how dedicated our volunteers are who help us monitor these boxes. And that monitoring looks a little bit like this. And this is actually what's happening here is you can see that this volunteer is using a camera pole. So this is just like a pool cleaning pole or something, some sort of extension pole, and has a camera on the top that they're sticking into the nest box. And then you can hook it up to your smartphone and you can see exactly what's going on inside that nest box. And this is a really, the least disruptive method of checking these nest boxes instead of putting a ladder up and peeking inside. Now you might notice too, this nest box is quite large compared to that volunteer. And if you remember that Kestrel box back here, that doesn't make too much sense. This is a barn owl box on a pole, which brings me to our next and final farmland raptor species here, the American barn owl. And barn owls, like American kestrels, they're cavity nesters. And some of the places that they end up are pretty creative. So we'll take a second here with the next slide to just appreciate that a little bit. And this is an example right here where my laser pointer is of a barn owl in the top left, barn owl in a natural tree cavity. And then here's another barn owl in a natural cavity and like a cliff face. And we've seen this down in Calvert County and Calvert Cliffs area on the cliff faces there, right along the Patuxent. But if we start to look at some of the other images, you can't quite tell what this is. This one between the tree cavity and between the cliff face cavity. And this is actually a barn owl nest on a balcony in Somerset County. And, so that the homeowners one day walked out and I'm sure were pretty surprised to have these little chicks hissing at them. And if you don't know what a barn owl chick or a barn owl in general sounds like, you should absolutely look it up. It's like a banshee, hiss and scream. Here, I find this pretty neat. This is a barn owl actually nesting inside of a hay bale. So just, if there's a hole in there, we see this a lot out west. Haven't seen it in Maryland though. Down here in the bottom right-hand corner, that's barn owls nesting in an attic. And the homeowner actually didn't know they were up there for a surprising amount of time. But most rudely, I would say, they nested in this machinery here on Poplar Island. And this is actually two different pieces of machinery. And there's Andy there. Actually, he's holding a barn owl chick. You can't see too well. But this just goes to show that barn owls there's not a lot of natural cavities for them. And this goes for kestrels as well. I could pull up examples for them. But by providing nest boxes, we're giving them opportunities to nest places other than balconies or attics or this machinery so that the construction workers can do their work undisturbed. And at the same time, increasing nesting opportunities in suitable habitat is really what's important. So here, to increase those nesting opportunities, like I said, with the kestrels, we want to put up these boxes, these nest boxes. You can see a few examples of barn owl nest boxes. The first one here is a marsh box that's going up with the help of a lot of volunteers. And these things are 70 pounds. I mean, they weigh a lot. It takes an army to put one of these things up. Here it's going up on the side of an old tobacco barn, along the Patuxent River Valley. And if we look, like I showed you for the kestrels, at this occupancy data for 2025, we can see that 30% of our nest boxes were occupied. Only 30%. Andy can talk about that a little bit more about the reason why Calvert County and the next nest boxes along the Patuxent account for a lot of this unoccupied territory here. But out of those occupied boxes, 2/3 of them are occupied and successful. So just like with the kestrels, this reinforces that same idea that when barn owls use nest boxes, when we put nest boxes for barn owls in suitable habitat, they can and do nest successfully. That same idea of you build it and they will come. And these nest boxes remain one of the most effective tools that we have for supporting this species. I want to pause here and talk about something that I find really fascinating. And if you look at the top right corner of this map, you can see that in 1630, so before widespread European colonization, much of the eastern United States was almost completely forested, right? And as you move forward through time and you snake around this map, you start to see that large areas of forest in the east there are being cleared. I find this so fascinating. And what I find fascinating is the thinking is that barn owls likely occurred in Maryland historically, but probably at much lower densities prior to European colonization. And they occurred they were largely restricted to these marshes and these limited natural grasslands. But as these forests were cleared and they were converted to pasture land and open agricultural land, there was new habitat that was becoming available. And the barn owls and other farmland raptors too were able to expand into these regions. This also brings me to a good point. The key distinction is what kind of agriculture was happening when this deforestation was occurring. And these colonists, they weren't using these rodenticides and pesticides. That same idea we keep coming back to. Those rodenticides and pesticides are making this sterile environment that's really food poor and does not allow farmland raptors to thrive. Barn owls, just like the other farmland raptors, they're doing best in these grasslands, these meadows, these pasturelands, these marshes, but not that intensively managed row crop area. So with that in mind, let's look again at the Maryland Breeding Bird Atlas maps and kind of see how they're doing today. So we're going to fast forward in time heavily here, but to 1983. Okay, so that first Breeding Bird Atlas, and I'll flip through the maps again. So those green blocks are where barn owls are confirmed to be breeding, and you can see that those green blocks just really drastically disappear from 1 to 2 to 3. And from the first to the third Breeding Bird Atlas, barn owls have declined by 79% in the state. It's absolutely alarming, even more so than the Kestrels. So despite the fact that, you see this 70.9% decline here, and I just want to talk about that quickly because during the first Breeding Bird Atlas, the gentleman that Andy mentioned, Scott Smith, really made a huge effort to document as many breeding barn owls in the state as possible. And that effort was not duplicated for the second Atlas. And this is a good opportunity for Andy to come back in since he was actually around and helped with that second Atlas, unlike
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, that effort to identify breeding barn owls was not duplicated from BBA1 to BBA2. However, it because of the concern of this species and their decline between those two atlases, that effort was intensified between Breeding Bird Atlas 2 and 3. So the effort to find barn owls during the Breeding Bird Atlas, the third Breeding Bird Atlas, was definitely as much, if not more, than was conducted in the first survey. However, during that time period, I and other researchers, Greg Kearns, were monitoring barn owl populations along the Patuxent River Valley during that first section of the Breeding Bird Atlas and all the way through present time. And I can personally tell you that the decline in the Patuxent River Valley between that first Breeding Bird Atlas and the second was very significant. It was not 70%. It was more in the upper 50%. And that shows a little bit more of a steady decline and not this sharp drop off between the first and second Breeding Bird Atlas. So, when you look at this thing in a larger picture from BBA1 to BBA3, that 79% is definitely an accurate representation of their population decline in Maryland. For those first maybe 25, 30 years of doing barn owl work, we pretty much focused on the banding of the chicks in order to get a look at nesting success along those in those nest boxes. In 2018, I met David Johnson next slide, of the Global Owl Project. We started working on a morphology program to capture adult barn owls, measure them, take a series of measurements to contribute it to the separation of American barn owl from common barn owl efforts. So one of the things that we actually learned, we set up these traps and started capturing barn owls. And one of the side benefits was that we were gathering a lot of terrific ecology information, population dynamics of these species. You can see here demonstrated under recoveries from 1960 to 2019, there were a total of 63 barn owl recoveries in the state of Maryland. And then from 2020 to 2025, pretty much as a result of our efforts in doing the morphology study, we recovered 27 barn owls. So, the data collection is 300% or more here as we start these efforts of capturing the adults. We've found out some really fascinating information about their population demographics, the population of the age structure of our population using our nest boxes is dominated by older birds, ATY standing for after third year. So these are older birds that are nesting in our nest boxes, and they tend to chase the youngins away and force them to find new territories to breed. Next. We found that even though that population is made up of older birds, you would suspect that they would keep the same mate and the same nest site. But in actuality, it doesn't seem to be working that way. Only 4% maintain the same mate from year to year, and 19% at least one individual maintains the same nest location. Recruitment into our population is very high, 55%. As a general rule, that means new birds coming in from other breeding territories into our study population. We know this by band numbers, recaptures from band numbers, or unbanded individuals. We had a very interesting development the winter of 24-25, a year ago, when we had a lot of snow cover, kind of timely talking about this today, that we had a snow cover in central Maryland for about 2 weeks straight. And it appears as if the breeding population of barn owls from central Maryland exited and left the area to go find food. During the spring, when we went to trap adults, many of the nest boxes that we trapped at had been used for a decade or more, were occupied by barn owls, but they were occupied by different individuals. We had a significant recruitment of new individuals coming into our population and occupying our nest boxes. So it just shows that weather has a significant impact on barn owls in the state of Maryland. One of the most common questions that I get from folks is, are these owls or these hawks going to eat my chickens or decrease the population of rabbits in my farm, or prey on bobwhite quail, which we're trying to conserve as well, or even go as far as eat my chihuahua? But I can sit here and tell you today that the answer is no. However, you may not necessarily believe just my word. Barn owls have been the most studied owl species in the world and even in North America. However, about 90% of the barn owl research done in the U.S. has been diet-based. And so we know very, very securely what these owls are actually eating from all of these studies about their diet. In agricultural settings, they feed almost nearly 90% on this little rodent in the upper left-hand corner called the meadow vole. Our population in the Patuxent River Valley kind of separated between meadow vole and marsh rice rat, these birds hunting in the marsh. Only about 20% fed on songbirds, and mostly blackbirds, red-winged blackbird, starling, cowbird, etc. And then 1% is just pretty much miscellaneous other small mammals. We have found evidence of small baby rabbit, snake skeletons, that sort of thing in some of our nest box pellet analysis. So you can see that barn owls are primarily a rodent eater, and in a agricultural landscape or pasture grassland, it's going to be dominated almost nearly 90% with these meadow voles, who are specifically, you know, create a severe crop damage for the farmers. Kestrels, American kestrels, on the other hand, Alex showed you the photo of the kestrel next to the mourning dove. You can imagine that, you know, the mourning dove is probably weighs more than a kestrel does, and therefore is not a target prey species for this little falcon. Any birds that they do prey upon at a 9% rate are small songbird size, but the majority of their diet is made up of grasshoppers, specifically during the breeding season when grasshoppers are active. The next in line are small rodents, mice and voles, and then small spattering of amphibians or reptiles. So these two species are known for sure not to prey on other birds that we are targeting for conservation work.
All right. And as Andy pointed out, a lot of what barn owls and kestrels are eating are species that many landowners would rather not have around. These are the things that damage crops, like he said. They contaminate feed or cause, a whole slew of other problems. And in that sense, farmland raptors can really be landowners' best friend, like you see right here. We don't necessarily want them, perching on your hand or anything like that. But this just goes to illustrate that they can take care of maybe some of those species that you might not want on your land and might cause you problems. And they provide this form of natural control. They work pretty relentlessly and replace the need for pesticides or rodenticides, these chemical means that aren't just affecting the target species, but they're actually moving through the food chain, right? And they're affecting our landscapes and our food, etc. And so if you're a landowner and you're interested in hosting a nest box, or you're simply interested in supporting farmland raptors as part of a more natural approach to land management, we'd love to talk to you. We'd love to get you involved. I mean, listen to Smokey the Bear here. Only you can help farmland raptors. I'm not a landowner myself, but I did come to this work through birding. And at the end of my talks, I'd like to share this Roger Tory Peterson quote that really speaks to me. And that is that birding, after all, is just a game. Going beyond that is what is important. And I'd encourage you all to go beyond that as well. If it's not birding for you, then just a simple appreciation and admiration for nature. So whether you're a landowner or someone looking for a volunteer opportunity, there's many ways to get involved. If you're interested, you can reach us at FRP _ that underscore is a little hidden there, coordinator at marylandbirds.org. And these are links to our website as well, just marylandbirds.org, and you can navigate to the Farmland Raptor Program page. So with that, thank you to our partners and supporters, especially the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Hawk Mountain, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but Maryland DNR and Maryland Ornithological Society, as well as many others. We seriously couldn't be doing this without your support. And thank you to everyone in the audience for taking the time to listen today.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, Alex and Andy. I have been curating a bunch of great questions, and I have actually categorized them, and I'm actually going to do something I've not done before. I'm going to share my screen with all the questions. Great. Well, I had a question with all the focus on nest. So we have four or five main categories: nesting, habitat and food, land use, land cover, predation. Three questions related to both. What are they predated by, and what do they predate on? Some of those you answered. A natural history and this rodenticide issue. And we had Steve, who's agricultural representative, mentioned that rodenticides don't seem like they're a standard practice. So maybe Steve would love to hear more about anything, more on that. So, but yeah, let's start on the nest box issue. I was curious, like, what happened to all the natural cavities? Have we had a decline in natural cavities in areas that are suitable habitat, like open grounds? Or is it also just a supplement to help them in the limited space that remains? They can then have higher densities in the few places that remain.
Andy, do you want to start and then I'll just expand?
Yeah, sure.
Just so
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So, traditionally, I'll start with American kestrel. Traditionally, they would be occupying cavities created by woodpeckers on the edge of the open fields, open forests, or open grassland, between the edge of the grassland and the forest. As agricultural practices have changed and we have become more involved with altering the habitat. A lot of these snags, these old dead trees that provide nesting sites for many cavity nesting birds, are removed. They're taken out. They're used for firewood, etc. And the landscape tends to be, quote, cleaned up. And that's when you clean the landscape like that, you take away nesting sites, potential nesting sites. Agricultural practices have changed over the last couple of decades now, whereas farmers used to leave or a crop buffer, a field edge buffer of unmowed grasses or mowed once a year or so, and now farmers are planting right up to the forest edge, so that is taking away some of that nesting ability as well. Barn owls, they utilize human-made structures that were added to the landscape as the farms were cleared. They would nest in barns, hence their name. They would nest in unused silos, abandoned buildings, things of that nature. As we have altered the landscape, we have removed a lot of those abandoned buildings, barns that are partially falling down. They all get taken out of the landscape and converted into, as you can see, human development. So human development has, in both cases, contributed to the loss of potential nest sites for both of these birds associated with agriculture and farmlands.
Right. Yeah. And I would say, we do a lot for a lot of different wildlife species, a practice called hack and squirt. If you've seen some of our past forest management practices where you can just simply kill undesirable trees and leave that tree standing if it's in a safe location where people aren't walking around a lot. And that can provide a huge amount of resources for not just these cavity nesters, but also woodpeckers and a whole abundance of other species. So a good practice to leave dead trees standing if they're in a safe location. Maybe we can knock out real quick. How do you keep starlings and other birds out of your kestrel boxes or any other?
Starlings are definitely a management issue. We do the best that we can with the removal of the nests, repeated removal of nests. That is very labor intensive. We're working with a number of different other kestrel nest box programs in the area and trying to come up with various methods that would help either discourage starlings or exclude starlings or occupy the starling in that nest box to where it doesn't reproduce but will stay there and continue to try to nest and not move on to another location. As long as they don't breed and they're not successful breeders in our nest boxes, I think that's the best that we possibly can do. There are, some various methods for trying to exclude them. By once the starling starts to nest in there, it's unlikely that a kestrel will come back and usurp the starling. So plugging the entrance hole after the starlings have begun to nest is a method, because usually kestrels are well into their nesting cycle by that time. As I mentioned, removal of the nests and eggs, and but there's also addling, oiling, actual piercing or cracking of the starling eggs that would occupy the starlings in that nest cavity, continuing to try to incubate for a long period of time and eventually not having a successful reproduction. So it's a number of different ways that we one of the big things that I would like to mention is that starlings, the placement of the nest box is, particularly with kestrel nest boxes, they really aren't an issue with barn owls, but the placement of the nest box can be very beneficial in controlling starlings. The kestrels like these nest boxes that are located smack out in the middle of the open area. If you put your nest box too close to buildings, barns, facilities like that, you're just going to be fighting starlings all summer long. On the forest edge, starlings will use them and they'd be less attractive to kestrels. So, getting them out in the open as much as possible is a key practice, and that will help limit somewhat the use by starlings. Barn owls, on the other hand, we don't have really much of a competition with other bird species using.
Great.
In fact, the only other
Also,
bird
kestrels kestrels predate a lot of European starlings, right?
they will eat starlings. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
So yeah, that's right. The only
Maybe
other
they'll
bird
help.
species that have to use a nest box, barn owl nest box, is a wood duck. So that's
The one thing I didn't hear you say, Andy, that I find interesting is that the substrate, what you put in the kestrel box, can be a big deterrent. So we're using pea gravel And the kestrel or the starlings will just try to remove as much of that peat gravel. They hate it. They do not want to nest on it. So they'll just try to remove it, and it'll really occupy them and give the kestrels some time to move in and, have a fair shot at competing with them before the starlings are too locked in.
Great.
And
Alexandra
the
asked,
Kestrels will usurp starlings and vice versa, so it goes back and forth. You can't say one way or the other that if a Kestrel wants the box, he's going to bump the starling out. That may not necessarily be true, and vice versa.
gotcha. Cool. Alexandra, also on this nesting topic is, I guess, placement of these nest boxes. I guess you want to focus on large fields or open areas. And what's the ideal spacing between the boxes? Will they share habitats for nesting or be territorial?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. If you read literature let's talk about kestrels first. If you read literature, it said that they should be, a minimal quarter mile apart because they do compete for the same food sources. However, the spacing of the nest boxes, both for kestrel and barn owl, is based on prey richness. If you've got an area that has good, ample, abundant food sources for them, they will nest closer together. We've got a number of sites here in Frederick County where two occupied kestrel boxes within about 300 yards of each other. That's and it's all based around food availability. Barn owls are the same. If it's a good rich environment, they will tolerate each other nesting relatively close. There's a nest location in Charles County where, again, we have two barn owl nest boxes on poles that are probably about 300 yards apart, and on good years when there's lots of prey, we'll have occupancy in both of those boxes simultaneously. In Boise, Idaho, I was fortunate to go out and assist with some capture of adult barn owls for a couple of weeks 2 winters ago. They have habitat that is just very rich for barn owls, and barn owls are quite abundant out there, and those birds will nest even in closer proximity, 30 yards apart. So
Great.
it's all about the food.
Right. And that's for our next category where we got at least 3 questions coming in. Somebody asked about red-tailed hawks eating a mole in their yard. And I think you answered this during the talk. Let me make sure I got this right. Moles are about 1% of the diet and voles were
Yes,
90%. Am I getting those numbers
that is
right?
correct. Yeah. So just a quick, short, small mammal primer. There are voles. They start with a V, VOLE. They are rodents. They have incisors. They gnaw and chew, and they do a lot of damage to crops and landscape. Then there's the mole, MOLE, who burrows underground. He's subterranean, and he makes those tunnels in your yard. Very rare occasions will come up out of those tunnels, but most of the time they stay buried in the earth. They prey almost entirely on insects. They are insectivores. They're not rodents. They don't damage plants. They have little sharp teeth that they eat soft-bodied insect grubs and earthworms and such. Then there's the mice, the mouse category. Those are the ones with the large ears, the long tail. They invade our space in the fall and winter. We have white-footed mice. We have house mice. A number of different species of mice, and then the last group are the shrews, which is in that photo that I showed, very long pointed snout with, and they are insectivores as well. They prey almost entirely on insects, and they have sharp teeth, and they don't damage plants or crops. So it would be, I have found mole remains in some of the barn owl box contents, pellets, but it's very, very low percentage. Like I said before, the meadow vole, who lives up on top of the surface, he runs around through the pasture land on trails and pathways through the grassland. He's the one who's the most favorite and most utilized by both of these kestrels and barn owls. Well, all four actually.
Right. I'm going to try and see if I can combine 2 questions here. Karen asked about, what is quality habitat and how does that affect good food resources? And I'll elaborate on that a bit. It sounds like grasslands are important. How long in Maryland, if we leave a agricultural field open for multiple years and don't disturb it, in the first 2 to 3 years, you'll have a pretty diverse grassland. Forbs start to move in, and you start getting small saplings at year 2, 3. Year 4, 5, 6, you start getting taller and taller saplings. And then, of course, you go longer and it turns into a young forest. Where is that sort of successional stage that's optimal for each of these? Is it sort of a 1 to 5 year early successional community, or what? Would you have some guidance on what qualifies
Yeah,
as
that's
for bobwhites? It's a very unique type.
Yeah, and I think it probably applies to these birds as well. I would imagine they're very similar to Bob White in that respect. Once you get woody material coming into your field, it makes it more difficult for these birds to hunt. They can't plunge in between, woody plants. So, herbaceous fields are obviously the most ideal. The meadow voles are going to move in relatively quickly. As soon as you get forbs and other grasses, they're gonna hop in there right away. As long as there's no pesticide or rodenticide use being applied. Meadow voles are going to invade those early successional fields relatively quickly, and that makes them very attractive to these raptors. Once they start getting woody material, then it makes it harder for them to hunt.
Yeah, and I'll share for bobwhites, we have a bobwhite quail habitat management guide that I put together. And generally, there's about 4 tools I like to talk about. And let's see if I can remember them all on the spot. We have grazing can be a tool to help limit, to keep the vegetation structure low. And there's a lot of nuance to how that's used. Fire, prescribed burning, which there's a lot of work right now on the Eastern Shore. We've got a prescribed burn association. For Maryland, we have a prescribed fire council that is working in policy. Herbicide as a tool. You can use selective herbicides to either spot spraying individual trees or different types of methods. And the fourth being disking. Oftentimes, we'd suggest disking over mowing, as a lot of times for bobwhites, although mowing is also another form of mechanical disturbance on the ground. And for mowing, we recommend March timeframe. So you leave cover over the winter, and then you can reset it right before the spring green up. The problem with mowing is that generally the trees won't die. The sweet gums, which generally are a pioneer species, they'll keep growing back. They'll have a stump at the bottom and they just keep growing up and they get more vigorous every year. So oftentimes you have to come in with some other, herbicide being probably the most quickest and most effective way to make a very strong reset of that woody material out. So any other things you'd add to that in terms of preventing tree encroachment?
No, I think that's the ideal. That type of work would definitely benefit both kestrels and barn owls.
Yeah. Cool. And these are also, and you might wonder, how did this naturally happen? And I think we look back and 100 years ago, there were a lot more fires happening across the landscape, fires that would just be left to burn many hundreds of thousands of acres. So historically, I think fire was probably the natural disturbance that would have helped us reset these types of habitats. And we also had a lot more big herbivores. We had elk, we had bison, and other grazers out there that would also have.
And I think one of the things that Alex has touched on in that land use slide is that agricultural practices have changed since late colonial times. There's fewer pastures. Colonists were mostly farming for self-sufficiency, and moving into large production type of farms is a different type of farming, and that changes the landscape. So I think that's a significant difference.
There probably was a lot more waste grain in the past, and that would feed animals over the winter, and other aspects of that. The efficiencies have definitely improved. Next stop. Oh, we had a question from Roger, which I thought was interesting, is the impact of solar. And I think there are some really interesting opportunities for solar with bobwhites. I've not studied it yet, but I know there's a lot of work to try to get native pollinator meadows and natural habitats in between solar panels. It's oftentimes not an ideal, like the premier or the best economic decision, but it's a way in which you could actually make maybe more grassland habitat on the landscape. I think there's some real potential there. I'm curious if y'all have explored that with solar and these species that you have.
Well, I agree with you that there is definitely a potential there for enhancing grassland habitat. I do know that barn owls hunt readily in orchards and in vineyards. Their hunting technique is flying low over the grassland, listening for the voles, and then pouncing on them. So it's definitely, in California, they're doing a great deal of work with barn owls as integrated pest control in wineries and vineyards. And these birds are flying between the rows of grapes and capturing type of habitat. They fly underneath of the orchard canopy. If you think about an orchard with apple trees, they create this canopy, and the owls will actually hunt flying below that overhang, almost in a tunnel type situation. So I just my own, I don't have any personal knowledge on it, but my guess would be that hunting between rows of solar panels would be suitable habitat for them. I certainly have seen kestrels perching on solar panels and solar fields, using those solar panels as a feeding purchase. Yeah, I don't foresee that as that could be an opportunity.
Great. Cool. Always looking
Yeah, nice
looking to find.
graduate study.
Yeah, yeah. I always look for ways in which we can make our landscape compatible, right? And
Yeah.
because a lot of this development is coming, and finding ways to make it work. All right, great answer to that, Roger. Good question. Predation. Both. So Jeffrey asked, "Are you finding any evidence of great horned owl predation on barn owls, or even Cooper's hawk predation on kestrels?"
Alex, you want to do this one?
I mean, the answer is yes, but everything that I know is, from your experience, we're constantly concerned about great horned owls when we're placing our nest boxes, right? So we think a lot about avoiding forest edges or great horned owl habitat. You could talk a little bit more about Cooper's hawks, can't you, Andy?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely Cooper's hawks are a one of the variables for kestrel decline in the East Coast, all up and down the East Coast. Their numbers have skyrocketed, and they will actually prey on kestrels for sure. Just anecdotally, from some of my friends who have been working with kestrels for decades, are saying things that they're where they used to see large groups of kestrels together hunting the landscape after post fledging family units of 6, 8 birds. They don't see that anymore these days, so that they may be less visible. They may be hiding more to stay away from Cooper's hawks, but definitely Cooper's hawk predation is a factor in their population decline. Just like bobwhites. These things are multi variable in terms of their population drops. And so Cooper's hawks are definitely one. As with the with the great horned owl depredation on barn owls, it's there are some things that you can do to help mitigate that. Horned owls have a difficulty entering a nest box because they're just not used to doing that. The way a barn owl will hang on to the front of the box and then pull himself in through the entrance hole. Horned owls are really not very good at that. Most of the time, predation from horned owls is reaching the foot into the nest box and feeling around and grabbing a chick or something of that nature. So there are nest box designs that have a baffle inside where the horned owl can't reach in and go around to get to the chicks. We have had some great horned owl predation, but not a whole lot. So, one of our box designs that we use for inside of silos has a small porch on the front where the barn owl can land and then hop into the box. That's the only evidence that I have found of great horned owls preying on barn owls is in that type of scenario. And in that situation, we just remove that porch, and then the barn owl has to enter the box, like it would with just an entrance hole. A 5 and 3/4 inch entrance hole is also helps to limit predation from great horned owls. Even though they can probably squeeze in that, it's difficult for them. Horned owls have great big feet, great big large feet, and for them to hang on to the entrance hole with those big feet and then push their head into the hole is a challenge for them.
To know. Now shifting over to predation by kestrels on bluebirds. If you have a bluebird trail and bluebird nest boxes, do you have issues with that?
It depends on what you define as issues. Okay, kestrels will prey on bluebirds. Okay, but not solely bluebirds. Okay, you saw in the description that songbirds only make up about 19% of their diet during the nesting season. So they will take a bluebird, obviously, and especially a young newly fledged bluebird is probably the ones that they prey on the most. But in terms of percentages of their diet, it's very, very, very small. So these birds have evolved together over time to exist in the same type of landscape. Kestrel's going to feed on those grasshoppers as much as he possibly can. And so they've lived together for a long time. And, and impactually, neither have decimated the other's population. We're managing a nest box on Poplar Island, which is an active tern colony from common terns, and common terns are endangered species in Maryland. They monitor this population of this nesting colony with cameras. And barn owls have been seen flying in and around the colony, but there has not been any real evidence that they have preyed on any of the terns. One of our goals for this coming winter is to analyze we've got about 3 seasons worth of nest box contents from that nest box on Poplar Island that we want to sift through and dig through to see if there is actually any tern feathers or skulls or anything in that nest box. But in my experience along the Patuxent River Valley of analyzing nest box contents of those birds, there have been a few Sora rail feet, a few Virginia rail feet found in some of those nest boxes. But you're talking about such a small percentage of the overall diet. So it's not impossible that they can't say that they won't prey on them, but it is very, very small. Bruce Colvin is a barn owl researcher in southern New Jersey. He's been doing the work there for about 45 years, and probably one of the most knowledgeable about barn owl ecology in the eastern United States. And talking with Bruce about this diet makeup of our nest boxes in the Patuxent River, he's pretty much saying that if it's not dominated by 90% meadow voles, then this is suboptimal habitat, that they're having to rely on birds and other animals to supplement their diet. So, it's probably not going to be a situation where, we grow the population of barn owls along the Patuxent River to where they're having any kind of negative impact on Soras or Virginia rails. And that's probably the scenario that I would guess is related to the black rail, is that they're not a significant predator for black rails. If given the opportunities, they're gonna catch voles. Now, that salt marsh on the eastern shore where black rails are found is dominated by a plant called Spartina patens, which is the salt meadow hay. It's a low growing marsh grass, and it supports a strong population of meadow voles. You don't think about meadow voles as being a rodent, but they are, and that's what these guys are eating in the marsh. They're eating these meadow voles.
Interesting. Great answer. So it might happen from time to time, but probably not a very large proportion. So
That's correct. Yep.
David asked, how much do I think some of these different raptor species you shared about compete with each other, or which ones might cohabitat together? For example, short-eared owls and harriers can use the same terrain. What about Kestrel? Does it compete with any of the other raptors you described? Dave says he's from Indiana and Kentucky on the Ohio River. Thanks for joining from Ohio. Or
Awesome. Very
yeah,
good.
Ohio
Alex,
River
take
area.
this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a fun idea. I'll start with red-tailed ox and great horned owl. So they're occupying, they're hunting at different times of the day, all right? So we like to think of the great horned owl as kind of the nocturnal red-tailed hawk. It's like the baddest of the bunch. It's going to be hunting the largest prey as an aerial predator. And we can think of harriers and short-eared owls in the same way. Although you can witness these pretty intense harrier and short-eared owl conflicts, pretty cool to watch because short-eared owls are crepuscular, so they're getting up right at dusk and dawn and the Harriers will often be up during those times as well. So they will compete for food sources, for territory, etc. But more often than not, the owls of our farmland raptors, so barn owls and short-eared owls, are kind of replacing the diurnal raptors, so the kestrels and the harriers at night. Kestrels are just right, they're hunting smaller prey like grasshoppers and things that the other farmland raptors we're talking about are not going to really be feeding on. But in areas where there's a lot of meadow voles, and some of the sites that we work at, I always like to talk about this one site where you can hear the meadow voles running around under the grass and even squeaking. And in prey rich sites like that, there's enough food to go around for everyone. So if you have anything to add.
Yeah, sure. On 3 occasions during our short-eared owl work in the winter, we have captured barn owls as well, in addition to short-eared owls. So they are out there actually hunting the same exact territory simultaneously together. Yep, it's again, you'll hear me say over and over, it's all about the food. If there's plenty of food, then they're not they'll be very tolerant of each other.
Great. All right. Now, natural history, we had one question. Just what is the barn owl home range?
That's one of the more common questions we get about the barn owls, and the bottom line is we don't really know. We're going to try to deploy some tracking techniques coming year to see if we can kind of get an idea about what their foraging areas are like. But there was some work done in Great Britain by Ian Taylor and the Barn Owl Trust that indicated that over there, a nesting pair would hunt in about a 500-acre territory during the nesting season, and that would expand out to about 1,500 acres in the winter months, which is quite massive. But there's, if you think about this, it's really relative to each individual pair. If an owl can find plenty of food within 100 yards of its nest site, why go any further? So I think that's a quantitative thing to say is that it's going to be within a 1 mile radius of their nest site. What we tend to do when we're selecting places to put nest boxes is we tend to look in a 1 mile radius of that nesting location and look at the habitat of that in that area to see if if there are good places for them to hunt within a mile. Research in Sweden has been shown that usually about a mile is what they would travel. However, they've documented an individual male who flew more than 30 miles every night to hunt and bring food back to its nest. So, it really is kind of relative to the landscape.
Right. Interesting stuff. And barn owls are non-migratory, it sounds like, compared to, I think, almost all the other
That's
species.
something we don't know. I mean, there's so much information that we don't know about all of these raptors. As I mentioned before, 90% of the studies on barn owls have been diet based. So there's not a whole lot known about their ecology. This past winter, a year ago, when we had this kind of a mass exodus of individual birds from central Maryland, and these were birds that had nested in these nest boxes consecutive years. They left when they couldn't hunt effectively. So areas where we know that cold temperatures and snow cover have negative impact on these birds. They're not like other owls who can plunge hunt through the snow. They are aerial hunters, so they need to maintain a slim body weight. They can't pack on a lot of fat. So cold temperatures and snow cover really does negatively affect barn owls. So in a situation where they have difficulty finding food, they have to leave. So that means in parts of Maryland that get snow cover, they may be migratory. They may fly to other southern locations and then return back to the area. That's just information we don't have. In years of mild winter, they'll stay all year long.
Interesting stuff. I think we got a couple more questions. We're coming to the end. Thanks everybody for joining on. I love going over because these questions were great. This is some of the best questions we've gotten. I want to shift over to power lines. Michael, Beth, I think Michael and Beth both had some insights on this, and One lived in Upper Queen Anne's County, sees Kestrels a lot. And what about contacting Chop Tank Electric to install boxes? Beth mentioned she's in Kent County. She sees them too. Can utility companies be partners, and can their poles be utilized? Perhaps there's ways to make power line cuts, open spaces, better habitat. I think Michael added, he says, I've worked with Chop Tank Electric for a number of years, developing different low-growing wildlife habitat types using integrated vegetation management, which has to be primarily conducive to the utility objectives. So definitely, I think about them a lot for bobwhite connectivity as well, and whether we can, so there's some of the last, it's a funny thing that I see power line right-of-ways as some of the best habitat left on the landscape for bobwhites. And it's a little concerning when you see that. You're looking at a landscape where there are roads called Quail Road, and it's a fully closed canopy forest, and there are no more quail. And the only habitat left for quail are the power line right-of-ways. So anyways, have you guys thought about that or worked with any power line right-of-way companies?
Yeah, we absolutely have. We're currently working on that because there's a lot of great habitat around power lines, right? Outside of the right of ways as well. And, through future partnerships, I'm sure we'll be able to better answer the question as to whether those right of ways and maybe some of those power line cuts that are a little more, have that very narrow, long type of habitat are suitable to support breeding kestrels more so than barn owls. But I think of, it's really it's a fragmented piece of habitat because it's this long stretch of suitable habitat, but the shape of it, I think, is very limiting for
Yeah, no, I
kestrels.
agree. I think I oftentimes look at them. I'm like, this is great habitat if we could just get more of the trees from the edge, because oftentimes it goes to
Yes.
mature forest at the edge, and those are oftentimes purchased for some of the biggest predators of these species. For example, Cooper's hawks.
Interestingly, a recent conversation that I had with Dan Small from Washington College, and you mentioned Queen Anne's County. There's a small section of kestrel nesting in Queen Anne's County that is pretty much limited to the power lines. These birds are actually nesting inside of open pipes in the power line. So that's something that we are looking to pursue. Anybody from Washington College who student would be interested in spearheading some nest boxes in that area would be very welcome.
Absolutely. And anybody knows anybody who are good contacts at the power line companies. We've searched for quite a while. We had some good leads, and then we've lost those leads. People moved on, and so some of those have gone cold, and so it's been hard to find the right people to talk to get that on the ground. So anybody in the audience who knows has contacts that would love to share, I'm sure we'd love to get in touch with those companies. It's a
Yes.
win-win, I think, to show some positive environmental benefits from management practices or adjustments to management practices that can really help. So, and one of the biggest ones, just to share, is reduce the mowing and shift over to, and this, a lot of people might have a negative reaction to herbicides, but shifting away from mowing and into use of just spot spraying herbicides to keep trees out allows for a richer diversity of forbs and cover and leaves better habitat on the ground. That's kind of the basic thing. And I know a lot of folks are doing this. A lot of power line companies are doing this as well. So, okay. Yeah. So that's a lot on the power line stuff. And then Stacy asked, and I might have a couple more have come in since I added this list. Stacy asked, can you talk a little bit about nest box lining or substrate for barn owls? Are you recommending shredded pine bark mulch for barn owls? Can you talk a little bit about box maintenance and sanitation?
Alex, you want this one?
Yeah. So that pine bedding, that you buy at pet stores, right, for gerbils or hamsters, that's suitable. But what is there's something that I'm not aware of because I never buy it, but you had mentioned, Andy, there's some sort of that bedding that isn't so good. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
cedar is not.
That's what
Cedar
it is.
chips are probably not. Yeah,
Right.
we'll stick away from that. But, Chris Snow uses the miniature pine bark nugget as his bedding for his marsh boxes out at Menai Bay, which seems to work well. Yeah, so anything along those lines. I would avoid, shredded mulch because it has a lot of soil, small organic matter mixed in with it. And, the barn owls will defecate and add their pellets and in their substrate. And it gets to be, and there's also, decaying prey material in there if they're eating it all. And, so, it could become a relatively foul environment. So, one of the advantages that the pine bark nugget has is that it allows this material, these droppings and so forth, to kind of sift down through in between in between the nuggets. Yeah, pretty much the same way with the pine shavings. We tend to use pine shavings because it's economical for us. Alex, talk about the recent work being done about cleaning boxes.
Yeah. So there's a gentleman at Cal Poly. I'm blanking right now, Andy, if you want to throw his name out there.
Matthew Johnson.
Yeah, that's right. And when I went to Andy and I have been talking a lot about this recently because I went to the Raptor Research Conference this past year, and he presented on this idea that uh, the presence of nesting material, and that nesting material that I'm referring to is barn owl pellets. So, like Andy mentioned briefly, what barn owls will do, what the chicks will do, is they'll cough up pellets while they're inside of the box or while they're inside of their nest cavity, and then those pellets will get broken up by the chicks just naturally moving around, by the adults moving around, and that actually becomes the nesting material. So if you think about it, the presence of those pellets, which we're calling the nesting material, it's actually a sort of a social indicator as to whether that box was successful in previous years. So the presence of a lot of pellets inside the box is going to mean that this is a good place to nest. There's a lot of food here. So what barn owls are doing is they're actually prospecting, and he has evidence of this. So they're going around and they're sticking their heads inside of natural cavities, nest boxes, etc., and they're seeking out the presence of these pellets, this nesting material, and then if there's a good indication that that nest was successful, they're going to be more likely to use that nest box. So, wasn't me who came up with this. Matthew Johnson kind of has the idea that you might be able to rapidly expand barn owl colonization of new areas through actually putting old nesting material inside of new boxes. It's quite interesting. And we've thought about trying this as well.
Cool. I also want to note and say thanks to, I think Rick Johnstone is on our call, and he added a couple of contacts for electric companies and their right-of-way folks. So I've jotted those down for you two guys. So thanks, Rick, for sharing that stuff. And I know he does a lot of work contracting for utility right-of-ways to do integrated vegetation management. That serves as better habitat. So I'll get you guys those links. And I think we are close to the end. So let me pull up my last couple of questions here. All right. Also, John mentioned contact the DNR. They probably deal with the right-of-ways on state forest land and have current information on who holds those easements. And John's from Pennsylvania, DCNR. Thanks, John, for that insight. I think that's actually coming to the end. We did have some insights from Michael, Steve, who works in agriculture. But it seems like there might be some, there's no official recommendations for things that like rodenticide and farmlands, but possibly it's happening. But he mentioned that a lot of times farmers are operating on very narrow margins and don't have, if it's not clearly going to help them, they might not be putting it out. So possibly definitely something to look into more. Maybe rodenticides aren't the main issue in some of these croplands, but maybe it's in other locations. And definitely would love to hear more from you, Steve, about how we can, any other things we can do to improve farmland management for raptors. And I will say that NRCS does a lot of work to do field borders. So if anybody has farmland and knows farmers, you can enter into programs or 10 or 15-year contracts to take some of the edges of your fields out of production, and you get a payment for that every year. And so that's another option to restore those without taking such an economic hit, if that's of concern. So couple of we have one trivia question. We got a few more coming in. Andy might want to mention the barn owl species split as a result of his morphological studies. Thank you, Kitty. I almost lost that one. Thank you for bringing it back up.
Yeah, the morphology study that I was mentioning was contributed to work being done to split American barn owl off from common barn owl. That occurred just in 2025. Yeah, that was
wow, cool.
Good stuff. Yeah.
So you contributed to that split and that decision on how they split. So there's a recent split of the barn owl worldwide into, I think, 3 subspecies or 3 separate species.
3 separate species. It's actually there are actually 5 separate species, but the two of them are isolated to small island populations.
That's a cool contribution to give back to our understanding of barn owls. And Tommy said,
well, hopefully that will afford them more conservation, being their own species.
And Tommy added, are there any hope these species could adapt to suburban or urbanization situations like peregrine falcons have?
Unfortunately, here again, it's all about the food. So, these guys are hunting open grasslands and pasture lands, which do not occur in urban environments. Peregrines are fortunate to be able to prey on rock pigeon and starlings and other avian life within the urban landscape, and so therefore their habitat, they're finding plenty of food in that type of environment, whereas these guys require that open field, that pasture land, that grassland or marshland in order to survive. So it would be unlikely.
I do think about it though, especially in more exurban environments or larger acreage home sites. There's a lot that I drive by that are, say, 5-acre field sites, and there's 4 acres are mowed and into turf grass. And I think there are some of these are at the scale and they're in relatively rural environments. I think I like to think of Doug Tallamy's work of the national park in your backyard. And I think there are opportunities, especially on the edges, if you have large acreage home sites and they're adjacent to farm fields, to just do a little bit more. And that turf grass is probably not great cover or the habitat they need, but it's if converted to sort of a fallow field that's mowed once a year or some practice like that, it could probably just contribute. And I think we just did a land use analysis of Maryland, and turf grass is I think it's the 4th largest land use in Maryland, somewhere around there. It's a huge amount of area in Maryland. So there are pretty big opportunities there, I think. But certainly on the edges in a more natural type of habitat, perhaps they could move in there. So that's something I want to keep working on and get more word out. And I think part of it is just changing the aesthetic. And when you see a natural grassland, a lot of people drive by and think, oh, that's a weedy mess. And wildlife love weedy messes. So I like to leave hedgerows and shrubs and that stuff that a lot of times people just look at and say, that's messy, I want to clean it up. That's the kind of stuff that oftentimes is some of our best, most limiting landscape habitat left on the landscape. So anybody listening has large turf grass areas, you can reduce your inputs, reduce your mowing, and get and maybe improve your habitat for bunnies, quail, kestrels, and a lot of other species. So I'll close with this last piece of trivia. Somebody asked, all right, you mentioned Roger Troy Peterson. Can anyone name the 2 North American birds that he never saw in the wild?
No.
I definitely don't know. So maybe you can pop it. There we go, Steve. Answer: Bachman's warbler and lesser prairie chicken.
Lesser prairie chicken. Yeah. How about that? Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys next month on thermal drones and how they can be used to understand deer bedding patterns, deer movement patterns, especially those trophy bucks. If you're a buck hunter and know somebody who's a buck hunter, that will be a good one. So thank you so much, Andrew and Alex. It's been great. This has been an awesome webinar. So thanks again, guys, and we will see you around. Good luck.
Very good. Thank you.
Appreciate all the work y'all are doing.
Thanks, Luke.